Good morning. I'm Rosemary Willink, and this presentation is about measuring. Is this good sound? Actually, can everyone hear me? Is that good? Is about measuring the risks around major museum projects and understanding why this is important for the human-centered museum. I've just completed a 3-year stint at the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art, working in governance and strategy and member of the Digital Working Group. So pronounced QAGOMA, it is possibly the hardest museum acronym to say out loud. But I welcome anybody who could prove me wrong. So I'd like to begin with 3 questions. Questions I've been trying to address for the past 3 years, and that may resonate with some of you. What is possible in an environment of scarce human and funding resources for digital initiatives? What is possible in an environment where top-line key performance indicators, such as attendance, visitor satisfaction, or self-generated revenue, are trending down? And what is possible in an environment where there has been little investment in technological infrastructure, or, and I believe much worse, professional development? So I'm not suggesting I can provide answers to these questions. I do believe, however, that by framing and raising these questions with colleagues and other museum professionals, it builds a shared understanding of the inherent risks and opportunities available to the sector at large. Risk appetite might seem at odds at a museum computer network conference whose theme is the human-centered museum. So my challenge is to persuade you that risk is not only about compliance, a checklist for managers to complete once every year, but that it can also be used to shape strategy and drive change in an organisation. Now, I would love to use an example, a museum where the relationship between strategy and risk is clear-cut. There are many to choose from. In the past 5 years, the sector has seen some bold digital initiatives in technology as part of their broader institutional strategy. In 2011, Mona, the Museum of Old and New Art in Hobart, Tasmania, gave visitors the O, a device to navigate the artworks in an underground museum. In 2014, the Cooper Hewitt presented the Pen, helping visitors engage with the collection through design. And earlier this year, SF MoMA launched a new type of museum app, which was the topic of Keir Winesmith and Andrew Mason's session yesterday. So as I mentioned earlier, I would love to use these examples because they show direct connection between strategy and risk. But you may have guessed this has not been my experience. QAGOMA is a 2-site institution and records, on average, 1.2 million visitors each year. I joined in late 2013, shortly after a change in leadership at QAGOMA and change in Queensland state government. So just as an aside, in terms of the Australian context, it's largely modelled on the United Kingdom, where museums receive a greater proportion of government funding than the private sector. For example, at QAGOMA, the target for self-generated revenue, and this includes corporate sponsorship and private philanthropy, is 30% of total revenue. I believe that's inversed here. So here you see that 30% in action, Audi's very subtle product placement at the most recent Asia-Pacific Triennial, QAGOMA's signature exhibition series. The Gallery of Modern Art, the GOMA in QAGOMA, opened to the public in 2006. The opening was accompanied by a series of blockbuster exhibitions, such as Portrait of Spain, Valentino Retrospective, Quilts, Saguo Chang, and David Lynch. But perhaps the most popular exhibition since GOMA opened was called 21st Century, Art in the First Decade. It was a free exhibition of contemporary art from the collection. So GOMA was a hit, not only for local and regional audiences, but it also gave people a reason to visit Brisbane, beyond the necessary stopover to get to the Great Barrier Reef. It became a destination. But to rip off the title from an excellent professional session yesterday afternoon, what happens after the launch? What happens in the months and in GOMA's case, the years that follow the initial burst of energy and public praise. What happens when the honeymoon period wears off? As you can see, since QAGOMA opened in 2006, the attendance has gone up and it's gone down. 21st century was the financial year 2011. And if anyone is familiar with the book Jumping the S-Curve, How to Beat the Growth Cycle, Get on Top and Stay There, by Paul Nunes and Tim Breen, the resemblance is uncanny. In order to jump the S-curve and follow the blue dotted line to sustainable future growth, the authors recommend encouraging a regular churn at the top, embracing an ad hoc strategy-making process, and renewing and aligning talent for future success. So QAGOMA was at risk of losing its reputation as a leading institution for the contemporary art of Australia, Asia, and the Pacific. This is its vision statement. And just as an aside, we know there are more meaningful metrics than just attendance to report against. What does it even mean to get on top in a sector made up of very different institutions with diverse audiences? But as a proxy indicator for effectiveness, on-site attendance is certainly popular with funders. Come every April, when the art newspaper releases its figures, museums worldwide are held to account, and QAGOMA is no exception. And if there is any forum to explore better, more human-centred measures, it's MCN. But this image was my context. This was what QAGOMA's trustees and the Queensland government wanted to see. Really long queues. So in response to this downward trend, the attendance trend in which you saw in that slide, and no blockbuster exhibition in the 1 to 2 year horizon, QAGOMA's chairwoman called for a strategic workshop on the topic of funding blockbuster exhibitions. My role was to work with one of QAGOMA's trustees, who just happens to be the Chief Technical Officer at the Australian Petroleum Production and Exploration Association, to develop a workshop activity on risk appetite. I think he and I were both interested to see where this conversation might lead us. It's not every day in an art museum you get the chance to discuss risk appetite with a technical expert in oil and gas exploration. So what is risk appetite? Essentially, it is the capacity or tolerance of an individual or institution to engage in an activity that involves some kind of risk in order to reach a desired outcome. The aim of the strategic workshop was to develop a draft risk appetite statement for the institution that would then be workshopped with staff, the risk managers. So this risk appetite statement had to do 3 things. Firstly, it had to address the uncertainty around funding that followed the change of power in state government. Secondly, it had to articulate the risk of inaction to QAGOMA's reputation. And finally, it had to resonate with staff at all levels of the organisation. It had to be useful. So the tool we used was much more about perception than it was reality. The executive team and trustees were asked to locate past blockbuster exhibitions on the leadership risk graph. According to leadership, which in other words really means reputation on the y-axis and risk on the x-axis. I wish I could say there was some kind of agreement in the room. Something that resembled this, where you see blockbuster exhibitions at different points on the leadership risk axis. Quilts was a touring exhibition from the V&A. Not a huge exhibition, but it tapped into a niche audience, which was actually a pretty significant audience of quilters. You have David Lynch smack in the middle, Sago Chang, yes, huge benefits, huge risk. But what they came up was more like this. I think in one group there was even a request for a different kind of quadrant. There's always one group. The results were illuminating and proved to be a useful tool for exposing the sometimes significant difference in perception of risk at the highest level. But more than that, it allowed for a discussion about the risk of inaction. So inaction is the kind of risk that is often ignored, particularly in medium to large non-profit institutions. And I believe this is largely because non-profit status is sometimes confused with a business strategy. I mean, the tool visually says a lot when the majority of exhibitions are found in one quadrant. To be sure, the bottom quadrant, the bottom right-hand quadrant, is not where you want to find all, if any, of your projects. Whether they be exhibitions, public programs, infrastructure upgrades, social media campaigns, or organising the Christmas staff party. Yes, that was also my job that year. So I don't really know what I did, but following this workshop, I was asked to overhaul QAGOMA's risk management framework and conduct the annual strategic risk assessment. It's a super exciting task. This would involve talking to managers about new and existing risks in their teams and developing tools that would help integrate risk management into day-to-day activities. There's really nothing like one-to-one at the water cooler conversations with middle management to get to know an organisation. I spoke with incredibly experienced registrars, technicians, curators, conservators, educators, exhibition designers and commercial managers. In fact, many of the people whom you see pictured here installing a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk for the APT. We talked about the risks they manage, the changing context for museums in Australia, and the factors, both internal and external, that affect their team's ability to achieve QAGOMA's objectives. But what I found was actually a real lack of agency. Managing risk, they thought, was outsourced to the risk management department, even though there isn't one. And even if there was, how effective could it be? Every team in a museum engages with some kind of risk, whether that be operational, strategic, financial, liability, or reputational. And when a team views risk as the responsibility of the mysterious, the elusive risk management department, rather than being part of their remit, their capacity to respond to change and fulfill museum objectives diminishes. It is true, some teams are exposed to more risk, and I mean this in the full sense of the word, than others. I'm okay if the head of security has a low, actually a zero tolerance for risk regarding the safety of visitors, workers, and artworks. I'm also okay if the head of visitor experience has a higher tolerance for risk regarding visitor engagement with the collection or organising public programs with polemical content. But you can see how these positions might be in conflict. I'm sure there are many examples of this type of situation. Intellectual property, fair use, and publishing online is just one example. So I saw this risk project as an opportunity for alignment between teams of the museum on really important issues such as information privacy and intellectual property, often relegated to that fictional department called risk management. So instead of structuring QAGOMA's risk appetite statement by departments such as ICT, registration, finance, my approach was to weight QAGOMA's risk tolerance according to its strategic objectives. And these are collection exhibitions, audiences and engagement, partnerships and practices. So I hope I haven't raised your expectations. QAGOMA is, after all, a public institution, and its overall risk appetite is moderate on a continuum that ranges from low to moderate risk tolerance. But what I want to point out is how this process raised staff awareness across the institution that not only are they responsible for managing risk, they also have agency in how they respond to and engage with risk. So shortly after completing the risk project, I wanted to use the same leadership risk activity with staff, though this time in an operational planning workshop. So that's a half-day workshop with the aim to discuss and decide on which new initiatives would be included in QAGOMA's operational plan for the next financial year. So we asked for draft initiatives in advance of the workshop, and these were then discussed and either championed or not by each group in that workshop. Don't you just love this body language? I was determined to leave that workshop with fewer initiatives than what we started with. In fact, I learned many things from working with the trustee and chief technical officer on risk appetite, but most importantly, he taught me that strategy is actually about what you don't do. The resulting initiatives would then become part of QAGOMA's operational plan in the next financial year. These included things like complete the redesign of the Australian collection using innovative display concepts, produce targeted digital initiatives that support audience engagement with our collection, or optimise physical collection storage and complete construction of a storage mezzanine. This time, however, I changed the y-axis to impact and the x-axis to cost. Again, there were some unusual discrepancies. Had the head of registration been in this group, I doubt the deliverable to build a mezzanine in the collection storage would be considered high cost and low impact. Certainly not for him. Again, it's all about perception. And like every tool, it's good at doing some things, but not everything. So having a risk management framework, risk breakdown structure, risk appetite statement, annual strategic risk assessments, decision trees, and other risk tools is all well and good. But if I've learned anything from my experience at QAGOMA, it's that there is no one-size-fits-all perception of risk, and that organisational culture eats strategy for breakfast. When your budget looks a bit like this one, naturally, you might take a more conservative approach and scale back the number of exhibitions, reduce opening hours, and other cost reduction measures. Arguably, this is exactly what you shouldn't do. The implications for a museum's reputation, both as a place to visit and a place to work, are significant. It takes time, however, for the impact of these cost reduction measures to show. But once an institution has lost its edge or its competitive advantage, it takes a long time to build that confidence and reputation back, that S-curve. So here's a very different example of risk perception. Am I all right for time? Okay, the two images on this slide illustrate a complex project. It involved commissioning a New Zealand and Maori artist, Michael Parakowhai, to create a sculpture on traditional land called Kurilpa, Place of the Kuril, and part of Brisbane's cultural precincts. I use the term complex deliberately and with the benefit of hindsight. From QAGOMA's perspective in the moment, the project was a complicated one. The risk was perceived as largely operational, transporting a very heavy bronze sculpture up the Brisbane River to its resting place. The public response, however, was complex. Many felt it was disrespectful to the traditional custodians of the land and complicit with a kind of cultural amnesia practiced in and by former British colonies. So I use this example because it demonstrates two things. Firstly, a complete failure by the institution for not addressing the cultural and personal sensitivities of the Commission. And secondly, it reinforces the need for a risk-attuned culture in order to become a human-centred museum. When risk management is integrated across an organisation, it necessarily creates a shared understanding of the risks and opportunities that face the institution. Organisational culture, we know, is often the reason behind the success or failure of new initiatives. In a culture where risk appetite is embraced, staff working in very different teams can engage in strategic conversations with a shared understanding of the museum's priorities. But what does a risk-attuned culture look like? It's one that responds to changing circumstances, where information is shared across teams to help inform decisions, and where risk is not just about how it can be reduced or contained, but rather instrumentalised. So I'd like to finish on a term that I'm actually still working through, and that term is speculation. So speculation is that aspect of the collective investigation that resists the repetition of established institutional and aesthetic forms. It is rooted in the rigorous investigation of collective experiences and focused on the material conditions within which we operate. This quotation is from Robert Sember's contribution to the book Speculation Now, a collection of essays and artworks that explores speculation as a framework for action and thought. I came across this book not so long ago, and I was struck by how artfully the term speculation was co-opted, or even wrested back from its strong association with futures and foreign exchange markets. This co-optation is not unlike the trajectory of other terms that have been operationalized through finance. Terms like risk appetite, maintenance, return on investment, innovation, competitive advantage. In the article Hail the Maintainers by Andrew Russell and Lee Vinsel, they describe this particular process as formulaic in feel. A term gains popularity because it resonates with the zeitgeist, reaches buzzword status, then suffers from overexposure and co-optation. So yes, I agree these are loaded terms, but I am interested in how these could be used strategically to strengthen the sector. And this interest forms the basis of my next project, a PhD on emerging institutional structures for art and architecture. Like my encounter with the Chief Technical Officer at the Australian Petroleum Production and Exploration Association, I'm interested to see where this conversation might lead us. Thank you. Questions? Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit more about the relationship between risk and speculation? Just repeat what you said.
I think, yeah, I guess I'm still kind of trying to think through this term speculation. And I think it relates a little bit to the session just before us because, I think startups have a role in that, and failing fast. I don't know if big institutions really can afford to fail fast. So I think I really like that definition because it wasn't just some kind of prediction or forecast, but it was like, well, how should we rethink our structure, like the business model for institutions? I mean, I'm really interested in things like public-private partnerships, or what Te Papa are doing with the incubator. I think these are all very interesting, not really core business activities of a museum, but totally could be. I'm not sure if that helps. Yeah, I mean, that book was really interesting. Very different take on speculation as a practice. Yes, yeah, Greg.
I wonder, could you talk a little bit more about the workshop that you led and how, who of the staff was involved, what agency they had, where that material went?
So we every year we do a workshop for the managers.
Yeah. Well, was it all managers in the staff one?
So there was a workshop just for the trustees and the executive team, and that was where you saw the blockbuster exhibition Nightmare. Well, it was actually just a very funny activity. And so we kind of carried that same process of getting managers themselves to where would they put their own actions? Like, would they say, well, actually, that's kind of low impact, but it's low cost, so that's okay. It's... so it really helped, in terms of representation at that workshop, it's what we call the senior leadership team. So they're the direct reports to our executive. So heads of registration, of collection, of design, governance, finance, and so the woman pointing, she was head of development. She's wonderful, actually. Head of the store, it was that sort of level. I guess there were a few, in order to get to that process, there was a monkey survey. We asked for, those classic 3 questions. What should we keep doing? What should we stop doing? What should we start doing? And I guess the point was we already had a draft plan. We just needed to use better language, more simple language, and we needed fewer things because they were all a little bit too general, like business as usual. and there were too many of them. So yeah, it was more of a process of what needs to go, really. Yeah. Does that fit?
Just to follow further on that, I was wondering for the executive, how much time did you take of theirs to do that workshop? Yeah. And also, was it easy? Did you get easy buy-in from them to be willing to do it?
Sorry, I should be saying the questions, I realised. So the question was, how much time did we take of the trustees? And was it, how hard was it to get buy-in for them to want to do it? Funnily enough, because it came from the chairwoman. So she said, I want a strategic workshop on this topic. Go. and that was, it was difficult to know what our role was then, because she had, just in terms of the hierarchy, so she has regular meetings with the director, and sometimes that gets fed down, sometimes it doesn't, and that's, that just happens. So what we did was we just went with something that we thought might work, sent that back to her in just one sort of example of the workshop, and I think we wanted to engage the board more. That was, for us, we were really keen because they're experts in their field. I'm not sure, I know that boards in museums in America, likewise, they would have expertise. They've gotten to a certain spot, but in Australia, they're appointed. So the government appoints board members. Yeah. So we had quite an interesting array of people. We had this guy, Rick Wilkinson from APIA. We had sort of a woman specialising in property development. These kinds of things that we really wanted to take advantage of. So we were looking for ways of engaging the board more beyond who can you introduce us to, that kind of conversation. So, and in terms of timing, it was a half-day workshop. I can say we have just had a workshop on a very different theme, which was philanthropy, shouldn't have. And we reduced it even further. I think the feedback we got initially was there was too many presentations, not enough sort of hands-on sort of thing. So the direction came from the top, and then we were just kind of guessing what would be the best use of their time. And then back and forth. Really.
That might be key to get someone up to say to do it.
Yeah, I think there's another term for this. And I guess it's called a deep dive. And often you'll hear boards, they want a deep dive on this particular topic. I wouldn't say, to be absolutely frank, very little came of these sessions. I think in terms of outcomes, it was not outcome oriented, but what it did do was get people talking about, well, we want you to take more risks. It was from the board to the executives, go for it, because we've got a lot to lose, but we really we'd built this reputation, we want to keep it. So yeah, done. Thank you.